I've also liked your phrase about the anti-moral act being one that is that contradicts the self-realization of the individual. And it seems to me both of us are trying to push beyond some of the trends that are very prominent in the modern world, the logical positivistic, the ultra-scientific approach, the stress, a mechanistic and highly deterministic point of view, which as I see it makes man just an object, and trying to find some alternative stance in relation to life. I wonder if you feel we're in some agreement on issues of that sort.
Yes, of course. In all these points I heartily agree, and I'm very glad that you enumerate them for me.
Well, and perhaps we could push into some areas where I'm not quite so sure. I wonder what some of your views are about the nature of man. When I've been asked about that, I think some of the existentialists take the point of view that man really has no nature, but it seems to me that he has. I've taken the point of view that man belongs to a particular species. He has species characteristics. One of those, I think, being the fact that he has I think he's incurably social. I think he has a deep need for relationships. Then I think simply because man is an organism, he tends to be directional. He's moving in the direction of actualizing himself. For myself, I really feel man does have a describable nature. I've been interested, for example, in the fact that you discuss the demonic aspects of man. I don't know whether you see that as a part of his nature. At any rate, I'd be interested in your views in regard to the nature of man.
Now, your question is very far-reaching and demands of me a little bit longer answer. The first point I want to make is that man definitively has a nature. And I think the best way to prove this is negatively, by showing how impossible it is if somebody denies that man has a nature. I think of the famous French existentialist Sartre, who has denied that man has a nature and has emphasized that man is everything he makes of himself, and this is his freedom. But if he says that this is man's freedom to make himself, then this of course means he has a nature of freedom, which other species do not have. So to make such statements is somehow self-contradictory. Even if you attribute to men what medieval theology attributed to God, namely to be by himself and not conditioned by anything else, even then you cannot escape the statement that man has a nature. Now that's my answer to the first element in your question, but there are two more, and I want to get at them. The second is that I distinguish, so to speak, two natures of man, or one which one rightly calls his nature and the other which is a mixture of accepting and distorting his true nature. The first one I would call, with a very vague term, his true nature, but to make it less vague, I usually call it his essential nature. And if I speak theologically, then I call it man's created nature. And you remember that this is one of the main points about which the early church was tremendously fighting, namely that man's essential or created nature is good. According to the biblical word, God looked at everything he has created, and behold, it was very good. And there is an even more philosophically formulated affirmation of this by Augustine, namely, esse qua esse bonum est, which means in English, being as being is good. Now that is what I would call man's essential nature. And then from this we must distinguish man's existential nature, of which I would say it has the characteristic of being estranged from his true nature. Man as he is in time and space, in biography and history. And this man is not simply the opposite of man's essential nature, then it wouldn't be man any longer. But it's a distortion of it. And an attempt to reach it, or to reach the true nature, or contradicting the true nature, it is a tremendous mixture. And in order to understand the real human predicament, we must distinguish these two elements. I believe that in Freud himself, and not Freudianism, and generally psychotherapy, there's no clear distinction of these 2 points. Now this was your second element. Now shall I answer also your third element, or perhaps...
Well, let me make one comment on this. I find in my work as a therapist that if I can create a climate of the utmost of freedom for the other individual, that I can really trust the directions that he will move. That is, people sometimes say to me, well, if you create a climate of freedom, a man might use that freedom to become completely evil or antisocial. I don't find that to be true, and this is one of the things that makes me feel that I don't know whether this is essentially or existentially, but that in a relationship of real freedom, the individual tends to move toward not only deeper self-understanding, but toward more social behavior.
Yes, now I would put a question mark to this. And I would say that first of all, who is free enough to create this situation of freedom for the others? And since I call this mixture of man's essential nature and his estranged nature ambiguous, the realm of the ambiguity of life, I would say under the condition of this ambiguity, nobody is able to create this sphere of freedom. But now let's suppose that it exists in some other way. I can come to this later when we speak about the demonic. Then I still would say the individual who lives in such a social group in which freedom is given to him remains an ambiguous mixture between essential and existential being. He is, as the English language expresses it beautifully, in a predicament. And this predicament is universal, tragic estrangement from one's true being. Therefore, I don't believe in the power of the individual to use his freedom in the way in which he should, namely fulfilling one's own essential potentialities or essentialities. These two words are here the same. So I am more skeptical both about the creation of such a situation and about the individuals who are in such a situation.
I would agree on the difficulty of creating complete freedom. I'm sure none of us are ever able to really create that for another person in its completeness. Yet what impresses me is that even imperfect attempts to create a climate of freedom and acceptance and understanding seem to liberate the person to move toward really social goals. I wonder if it is your thinking about the demonic aspect that makes you put a question mark after that.
Now let me first answer you what you just said. And here I would very much agree. I would say there are fragmentary actualizations in history. And I agree especially with the deep insight we have gained largely by psychotherapy about the tremendous importance of love in earliest ages of the development of children. So the question would come here, where are the forces which create a situation in which the child receives that love which gives him later on the freedom to face life and not to escape from life into neurosis and psychosis. And I leave that question open. But now you are interested about the demonic. And you are not the only one. I myself was, and everybody is in some way. So let me say how I came to this concept. I wrote in the year 1926, when I still was professor at the University of Dresden in Germany, a little article, little pamphlet, The Demonic. And the reason not to speak of the fallen men or the sinful men or any of these phrases was that I saw from 2 points of view structures which are stronger than the goodwill of the individual. And one of these structures was the neurotic psychotic structure. I came into contact after the First World War, since 1920 about, with the psychoanalytic movement coming from Freud at that time and changing the climate of the whole century already in Europe at that time. And the second was the analysis of the conflicts of society by the socialist movement and especially by the early writings of Karl Marx. And in both cases I found a phenomenon for which these traditional terms like fallen men and sinful men are not sufficient. The only sufficient term I found in the New Testament use of the term demonic, which is in the stories about Jesus similar to being possessed. That means being in a force, under a force which is stronger than the individual goodwill. And so I use that term, of course. I emphasize very much, I don't mean it in a mythological sense, as little demons or a personal Satan running around the world, but I mean it as structures which are ambiguous, both to a certain extent creative, but ultimately destructive. And this is the reason why I introduced that term. So instead of only speaking of estranged mankind and not using the old terminology anyhow, I had to find a term which covers the transpersonal power which takes hold of a man and of society, of a man in stages, let's say, of drunkenness, being a drunkard, and not being able to overcome it, or producing a society in which either class conflicts or, as today in the whole world, conflicts of great ideologies, of great forms of political faith struggle with each other, and every step to overcome them has usually the consequence to drive the people more deeply into them. Now this is what I meant with the demonic. So I hope I made one thing clear, that I don't mean it in old mythological sense, which of course has to be demythologized.
And certainly when I look at some of the things going on in the world from the power point of view and so on, I can see why you might think in terms of demonic structures. I'd like to talk a little bit about the way I see this matter of alienation and estrangement. It seems to me that the infant is not estranged from himself. To me, it seems that the infant is a whole and integrated organism, gradually individual, and that the estrangement that occurs is one that he learns, that in order to preserve the love of others, parents usually, he takes into himself as something he has experienced for himself the judgments of his parents, just like the small boy who's been rebuked for pulling his sister's hair goes around saying, bad boy, and meanwhile he's pulling her hair again. In other words, he's introjected the notion that he's bad, where actually he's enjoying the experience. And it's this estrangement between what he is experiencing and the concepts he links up with what he's experiencing that seems to me to constitute the basic estrangement. I don't really want to comment on that because I also want to get into the kind of thing that heals it, the relationship, but perhaps you...
Yes, because the infant is a very important problem. I call in more philosophical or better psychological terms the mythological state of Adam and Eve before the fall, sleeping, dreaming innocence. It has not yet reached reality. It is still dreaming. Of course, this also is a symbol, but it's a symbol which is nearer to our psychological language than the fall of Adam and Eve. But it means the same thing, and it means that Adam, namely men, Hebrew Adam means men, that man, every man, is in a process of transition from dreaming innocence to conscious self-actualization. And in this process, the estrangement also takes place, as well as the fulfillment, therefore my concept of ambiguity. And I agree with you that there is also in what the parents used to call bad boy or bad girl, there is also a necessary act of self-fulfillment. But there is also something asocial in it, because it hurts his sister. And so it has to be repressed, and whether we say bad boy or prevent it in any other way. This is equally necessary. And these experiences mean for me the slow process of transition from dreaming innocence into self-actualization on the one side and self-estrangement on the other side. And these two acts are ambiguously intermixed. So that would be about my interpretation of the situation of the infants.
Well, there's much in that I would agree with. I'd like to say a little bit about the kind of relationship in which I think man's estrangement can be healed, as I see it from my own experience. For example, when we talk about, when either of us talk about the courage to be or the tendency to become oneself, I feel that perhaps that can only be fully achieved in a relationship. Perhaps the best example of what I'm talking about is that I believe that the person can only accept the unacceptable in himself when he is in a close relationship in which he experiences acceptance. This I think, is a large share of what constitutes psychotherapy, that the individual finds that the feelings he has been ashamed of, or that he has been unable to admit into his awareness, that those can be accepted by another person, so then he becomes able to accept them as a part of himself. I don't know too much of your thinking about interpersonal relationships, but I wonder how that sounds to you.
I believe that you are absolutely right in saying that without the man-to-man experience of forgiveness, or better, acceptance of the unacceptable, is a very necessary precondition for self-affirmation. And you cannot forgive yourself, you cannot accept yourself. If you look in the spiritual mirror, then you are much more prone to hate yourself and to be disgusted with yourself. So I believe that all the forms of confessional in the churches and the confessions between friends and married people, and now the psychoanalytic confession of one's deeper levels, which are opened up by the analyst, that without these things there is no possibility of experiencing something of which, however, I would say it belongs ultimately to another dimension, the dimension of the ultimate, let me call it preliminarily. But I would say, with you, only the right acceptance is the medium through which it is necessary men have to go from man to man before the dimension of the ultimate is possible. And I may add here that I have not used often anymore the word forgiveness, because this often produces a bad superiority in him who forgives and the humiliation of him who is forgiven. Therefore, I prefer the concept of acceptance. And if you accept this acceptance, then I think I can confess that I have learned it from psychoanalysis, I have learned to translate a theological concept which doesn't communicate any longer and replaced it by the way in which the psychoanalyst accepts his patient, not judging him, not telling him you must first be good, otherwise I cannot accept you, but accepting him just because he is not good, but he has something in himself which wants to be good.
Certainly in my own experience, the potency of acceptance of another person has been demonstrated time and time again. When an individual feels that he is both fully accepted in all that he's been able to express and yet prized as a person, this has a very potent influence on his life and on his behavior.
Yes, now I believe that this is really the center of what we call the good news in the Christian message. The minister who represents the ultimate meaning of life can have much skill unconsciously, although he is unskilled. But even then, he should not establish himself as a second-rate psychotherapist. Now that seems to me a very important rule. Otherwise, our cooperation would soon end in little catastrophes and would come to an end altogether.
Well, that sort of sets off in me a somewhat deeper question. I realize very well that I, and I think many other therapists, are interested in the kind of issues that involve the religious worker and the theologian. And yet, for myself, I prefer to put my thinking on those issues in humanistic terms, or to attack those issues through the channels of scientific investigation. I guess I have some real sympathy for the modern view that is sort of symbolized in the phrase that God is dead. That is, that religion no longer does speak to people in the modern world. And I would be interested in knowing why you tend to put your thinking, which certainly is very congenial to that of a number of psychologists these days, why you tend to put your thinking in religious terminology and theological language.
No, I think that is a very large question.
Yes, I'm sure.
And it could take all our time. So I want to confine myself to a few points. Now, first, the fundamental point is that I believe, metaphorically speaking, man lives not only in the horizontal dimension, namely the relationship of himself as a finite being to other finite beings, observing them and managing them. But he also has in himself something which I call metaphorically the vertical line. The line not to a heaven with God and other beings in it, but what I mean with the vertical line is towards something which is not transitory and finitude and finite, something which is infinite, unconditional, ultimate. I usually call it, man has an experience in himself that he is more than a piece of finite objects which come and go. He experiences something beyond time and space. I don't speak here, I must emphasize this in such speeches again and again, in terms of life after death or in other symbols which cannot be used in this way anymore. But I speak of the immediate experience of the temporal, of the eternal in the temporal, or of the temporal invaded by the eternal in some moments of our life, and of the life together with other people, and of the group life. Now that is for me the reason why I try to continue to interpret the great traditional religious symbols as relevant for us. Of course I know, and that was the other point you made, that they have become largely irrelevant, and that we cannot use them in the way in which they are used still very much in preaching and religious teaching and liturgies for people who can live in them, who are not by critical analysis estranged from them, but for those large amount of people who you call humanists, we need a translation, an interpretation of these symbols, but not, as you seem to indicate, a replacement. I don't believe that scientific language is able to express the vertical dimension adequately, because it is bound to the relationship of finite things to each other, even in psychology, and certainly in all physical sciences. This is the reason why I think we need another language. And this language is the language of symbols and myths. It is a religious language. But we poor theologians, in contrast to you happy psychologists, are in the bad situation that we know the symbols with which we deal have to be reinterpreted, and even radically reinterpreted. But I have taken this heavy yoke upon myself, and I have decided long ago I will continue to the end with it.
Well, I realize as you were talking, I have sort of a fantasy of this vertical dimension, not going, for me, not going up but going down. What I mean is this: I feel at times when I'm really being helpful to a client of mine, in those sort of rare moments when there is something approximating an I-thou relationship between us, and when I feel that something significant is happening, then I feel as though I am somehow in tune with the forces in the universe, or that forces are operating through me in regard to this helping relationship, that well, I guess I feel somewhat the same way the scientist does when he is able to bring about the splitting of the atom. He didn't crack it with his own little hands, but he nevertheless put himself in line with the significant forces of the universe, and thereby was able to trigger off a significant event. And I feel much that same way, I think, oftentimes in dealing with a client when I really am being helpful.
Now, I'm very grateful about what you say now. The first words were especially interesting to me when you said a vertical line has always an up and a down. And you will be interested to hear from me that I am accused very often by my theological colleagues that I speak much too much of down instead of up. And that's true. When I want to give a name for what I am about ultimately concerned, then I call it the ground of being. And ground is, of course, down and not up. So I go with you down. Now the question is, where to do we go? And here again, I had the feeling I could go far away with you when you used the term universe, forces of the universe. But when I speak of ground of being, I don't understand this depth of the universe in terms of an addition of all elements in the universe, of all single things, but as many philosophers and theologians did, the creative ground of the universe, that out of which all these forms and elements come. And I call it the creative ground. And this was the second point in which I was glad. This creative ground can be experienced in everything which is rooted in the creative ground. For instance, in a person-to-person encounter. And I had, without being an analyst, but have many forms of encounters with human beings, very similar experience as you, that now here is something present which transcends the limited reality of the thou and the ego, of the other one and of myself. And I sometimes called it in special moments the presence of the holy in a non-religious conversation. That I can experience and have experienced, and I agree with you. And then finally, there was your third point about the scientists. And I often told my scientist friends that they follow strictly the principle formulated classically by Thomas Aquinas, great medieval theologian. If you know something, then you know something about God. And I would agree with this statement, and therefore these men also have an experience of what I like to call the vertical line, down, and perhaps also up, although what they do in splitting atoms is discovering and managing finite relations to each other.
I'd like to shift to another topic that has been of interest to me, and I suspect may be of interest to you. This is the question of what constitutes the optimal person. In other words, what is it that we're working toward, whether in therapy or in the area of religion? For myself, I have a rather simple definition, and yet one which I think has a good many implications. I feel that I'm quite pleased in my work as a therapist if I find that my client and I too are, if we're both moving toward what I think of as greater openness to experience. If the individual is becoming more able to listen to what's going on within himself, more sensitive to the reactions he's having to a given situation, if he's more accurately perceptive of the world around him, both the world of reality and the world of relationships, then I think my feeling is I will be pleased. That's the direction I would hope we would move, because then he will be in the process. First of all, he will be in process all the time. He won't, this isn't a static kind of goal for an individual. And he will be in the process of becoming more fully himself. He'll also be realistic in the best sense, in that he's realistic about what is going on within himself as well as realistic about the world. And I think he will also be in the process of becoming more social, simply because one of the elements which he can't help but actualize in himself is the need and desire for closer human relationships. So for me, this concept of openness to experience describes a good deal of what I would hope to see in the more optimal person, whether we're talking about the person who emerges from therapy or the development of a good citizen or whatever. I wonder if you would have any comments on that, or on your own point of view in that area.
Yes, now there are two questions in this. The one is the way, namely the openness, and the other is the aim. It is, of course, not a static aim, but a dynamic aim, but it's an aim.
Yes, okay.
And let me speak to both points. The openness is a word which is very familiar to myself, because there are many questions a theologian is asked and which can be answered only by the concept of openness or opening up. I will give you two examples. The one example is the function of classical symbols and symbols generally. I always used to answer, symbols open up. They open up reality, and they open up something in us. If this word were not forbidden in a university today, I would call it something in our soul. But you know, as I myself, as a psychologist, somebody who deals with the soul, that the word soul is forbidden in academic context. But that's what symbols do. And they do it not only to individuals, they do it also to groups. And usually only through groups to individuals. So that's the one thing where I use the word open. This seems to me one of the main functions, perhaps the main functions of symbols, namely to open up. Then another use of the word open is that I am asked now, what can I do to experience God or to get the divine spirit or things like that? And my answer is, the only thing you can do is keep yourselves open. You cannot force God down. You cannot produce the divine spirit in yourselves. But what you can do is to open yourself, to keep yourself open for it. And this is, of course, in your terminology, a particular experience. But we must keep open for all experiences. So I would agree very much with the way which you have described. I would even believe that in all experiences there is a possibility of having an ultimate experience. Then the aim. Now the aim is manifoldly discussed. Perhaps we could agree about realization of our true self, bringing into actuality what is essentially given to us. Or, when I speak in religious symbolism, I could say to become the way in which God sees us in all our potentialities. And what that now practically is the next and very important question. You also indicated something of this, namely to become social. I think this is a part of a larger concept. I would call it love in the sense of the Greek word agape, which is a particular word of the New Testament, and which means that love which is described by Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, and which accepts the other as a person and then tries to reunite with him and to overcome the separation, the existential separation which exists between man and man. Now this aim, I would agree, but I would add, of course, since I speak also in terms of the vertical dimension, that it is the keeping to that dimension, to maintain in the faith into an ultimate meaning of life and the absolute and unconditional seriousness of this direction, of this ultimate aim of life. So when I shall speak now in popular terms, it's very dangerous always, I would say faith and love as the two concepts which are necessary, but faith not in the sense of beliefs, but in the sense of being related to the ultimate, and love not in the sense of any sentimentality, but in the sense of affirming the other person and even one's own person. Because I believe with Augustine and Eric Fromm and others that there is a justified self-affirmation and self-acceptance. I wouldn't use the word self-love, that's too difficult, but self-affirmation and self-acceptance, one of the most difficult things to reach.
Well, I find that I like it best when you become concrete. That is, when you put it like in terms of faith and love. Those can be very abstract concepts which can have all kinds of different meanings. But putting it in the concrete, yes, I do feel that the person does have to gain I wouldn't even hesitate to say, he has to gain a real appreciation of or liking of himself if he is going to affirm himself in a healthy and useful fashion. There's one other corollary to this notion of being open to experience that you might explore a bit too. To me, the individual who is reasonably open to his experience is involved in a continuous valuing process. It is, I think that I realize I've sort of dropped the notion of values in the conventional sense of there being certain values which you could list and that kind of thing. But it does seem to me that the individual who is open to his experience is continually valuing each moment and valuing his behavior in each moment as to whether it is related to his own self-fulfillment, his own actualization. And that it's that kind of valuing process that to me makes sense in a mature person. It also makes sense in a world where the whole situation is changing so rapidly that I feel that ordinary lists of values are probably not as appropriate or meaningful as they were in periods gone by.
Yes, now I am an outspoken critic of the philosophy of values, so I certainly agree with you. I replace this thing by my concept of agape or love, namely love which is listening. I call it listening love, which doesn't follow abstract valuations, but which is related to the concrete situation. And out of its listening to this very moment gains its decision for action and its inner feeling of satisfaction and even joy, or dissatisfaction and bad conscience.
I like that phrase because I think it could be a listening within, a listening to oneself, as well as a listening love for the other individual.
Yes, when I say listening to the situation, I mean the situation is constituted out of everything around me and myself. So listening love is always listening to both sides.
Well, that's certainly, I feel we're not very far apart in our thinking about this value approach. I thought we might be further apart than we seem to be. But one other instance, I feel that the small infant is a good example of a valuing process that's going on continuously. He isn't troubled by the concepts and standards that have been built up for adults, and he's continually valuing his experience as being either making for his enhancement or being opposed to that actualization.
Now this valuation, of course, would be not an intellectual valuation,
No,
but a valuation with his whole being.
I think of it as an organismic valuing process.
That means a reaction of his whole being, and I certainly believe that it is an adequate description.